Outlaw's widow hid gold in her cabin. Unaware her husband's gang was watching, she thought burying her dead husband's stolen gold would finally set her free. But some secrets refused to stay buried, and Jake Cassidy's gang was still very much alive. The shovel bit into the hard earth beneath Ellen Cassidy's cabin floor with a sound like breaking bones. 3 months had passed since they'd laid Jake in the ground. 3 months since the last echo of gunfire had faded from the canyon walls, and still she could feel his presence in every shadow that danced across the weathered pine boards. The gold sat heavy in the canvas sack beside her knees, 27 pieces that had cost more lives than she cared to count. Each coin caught the flicker of her single candle, throwing light that seemed to pulse like a dying heartbeat. Jake had called it their future once, back when his smile still held warmth instead of the cold hunger that had consumed him in those final years. Mary Ellen's hands trembled as she lowered the sack into the hole she'd carved from the earth. The weight of it settled with a dull thud that seemed to echo through her chest. This was supposed to be freedom. This was supposed to be the end of blood money and sleepless nights, the end of wondering which shadow might hold a man with murder in his eyes. She began to shovel the dirt back over Jake's final sin. Each scoop felt like burying a piece of her old life. The woman who'd closed her eyes to where the money came from, who'd mended bullet holes in her husband's shirts without asking questions, who'd learned to cook beans quiet-like so as not to wake a man who slept with one hand on his gun. The wind picked up outside, setting the cabin walls to creaking like old bones. Mary Ellen paused in her work, listening. 3 months alone had taught her to know every sound this place made, every groan and whisper that meant nothing more than settling wood and shifting earth. But tonight felt different. Tonight the silence between the wind gusts felt thick with watching eyes. She shook her head and kept digging. Foolish thoughts were all they were. The kind that came to women who'd spent too many nights alone with nothing but memory for company. Jake was dead. She'd seen his body herself, seen the way the undertaker had to fold his hands just so to hide the rope burns on his wrists where they dragged him behind his horse. The law had caught up to Jake Cassidy at last, and with him had died the last of the Cassidy gang. Or so she told herself through 3 months of careful rebuilding. The floorboards went back into place with practiced ease. She'd pulled them up a dozen times in the past weeks, checking and rechecking her work, making sure the hiding place looked natural. A woman alone needed to be careful with her secrets, especially secrets that men had killed for. Mary Ellen swept the loose dirt into her apron and carried it outside, scattering it beneath the old apple tree where Jake had proposed to her 7 years ago. Back when she believed in futures that didn't include blood on the money that bought their bread. The night air carried the scent of sage and dust, clean smells that seemed to wash some of the weight from her shoulders. She stood there in the darkness, letting the wind tug at her hair, and for the first time in months felt something that might have been peace. That's when she saw the cigarette ember glowing like a red eye in the tree line. Her blood turned to ice water in her veins. The ember moved just slightly as whoever held it shifted their weight. Then another appeared, 20 feet to the left, and another, off toward the creek where the shadows ran deepest. Mary Ellen forced herself to breathe, forced her feet to carry her back toward the cabin door as if nothing had changed. But her mind raced like a Mustang with wolves on its heels. 3 men, maybe more, watching, waiting. She reached for the door handle with fingers that wanted to shake, stepped inside, and turned the heavy bolt Jake had installed after their first year of marriage. The metal sliding home sounded loud as thunder in the silence. Through the window glass, the cigarette embers still glowed like fallen stars. She counted them again, 3 points of light arranged in a half circle around her little sanctuary. Patient, predatory. Mary Ellen sank into Jake's old chair by the cold fireplace and stared at the floorboards that hid 27 pieces of gold. She thought burying the money would bury the past with it. But some ghosts, she realized now, don't need graves to keep them walking. Outside in the darkness, men who'd once called Jake Cassidy brother were done waiting for a widow to lead them to their prize. The night stretched ahead of her like a held breath, and Mary Ellen Cassidy understood that her real troubles were just beginning. When three armed men kicked down her door at dawn, Mary Ellen knew her dead husband's sins had finally come home, but she wasn't the same helpless woman they remembered. Dawn came like a bruise across the sky, purple and angry and full of threat. Mary Ellen had not slept. She'd spent the hours before sunrise sitting in Jake's chair with his old shotgun across her knees, watching the windows, listening to every creak and whisper the wind carried through the canyon. The cigarette embers had vanished with the darkness, but she could still feel eyes on her like spider legs crawling across her skin. Somewhere out there, patient as buzzards, Jake's old partners were waiting for their moment. She didn't have to wait long. The spurred boots on her porch sounded like thunder rolling down from mountains. Heavy, deliberate. The footsteps of men who weren't trying to hide anymore. Mary Ellen. The voice came through the door like gravel sliding down a slope. She knew it without having to see the face. Brennan McClure, Jake's old partner, the one with scars across his cheek where a deputy's knife had found its mark 3 summers back. "Open up, darling. We need to have ourselves a talk." Mary Ellen's hands tightened on the shotgun. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. "Nothing to talk about, Brennan. Jake's dead and buried. Whatever business you had with him died with him." A low chuckle answered her, the sound of a wolf finding a wounded deer. "Now that ain't quite true, is it? See, Jake had something that belonged to all of us. And seeing as how you're his widow, well, that makes it your responsibility now." The door exploded inward with a crash of splintered wood and twisted hinges. Brennan filled the doorway like a storm cloud, his hand resting easy on the gun at his hip. Behind him came Dutch Morrison, thick as a tree trunk and twice as mean, and young Tommy Walsh with his soft boy's face and killer's eyes. Mary Ellen raised the shotgun, but Brennan was already moving, faster than a man his size had any right to be. His hand closed over the barrel and twisted, and suddenly she was staring down the wrong end of her own gun. "Now that wasn't very hospitable," Brennan said, his scarred face splitting into a grin that held no warmth. "Here we come calling like civilized folks, and you greet us with buckshot." He tossed the weapon to Dutch, who caught it with meaty hands. "Let's try this again. Where's Jake's share of the Millerville job?" "I don't know what you're talking about." The lie came easier than she'd expected. 3 months of practice had taught her how to keep the truth buried deep. Brennan's backhand caught her across the cheek hard enough to split her lip. She tasted blood, copper, and salt, but didn't give him the satisfaction of crying out. "Course you do," he said conversational-like, as if he hadn't just struck her. 27 gold pieces from a bank job. Jake's cut. He never spent it, never traded it, never gave it away. Which means it's here somewhere." His eyes swept the cabin's single room, taking in the simple furniture, the cold fireplace, the carefully swept floor. "Question is where?" Dutch was already moving, overturning chairs and pulling out drawers with the enthusiasm of a child breaking toys. Flowers scattered across the floor in white clouds. Her carefully mended curtains came down in a tangle of torn fabric. The little wooden box where she kept her sewing needles hit the wall and exploded into splinters. Mary Ellen watched them destroy the piece she'd spent 3 months building and felt something cold and hard settle in her chest. These men had taken Jake from her, not with bullets, but with their greed and their violence and their endless hunger for more. Now they wanted to take this too. "Tear it apart," Brennan told Dutch, settling into Jake's chair like a king claiming a throne. "Every board, every stone. It's here somewhere." Tommy lingered by the door, his young face troubled. He kept looking at Mary Ellen with something that might have been guilt, might have been conscience. She caught his eye and saw him flinch away like a scalded child. "You don't have to be here for this, Tommy," she said quietly. "This isn't what Jake would have wanted." "Don't." Brennan's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you speak his name. You think because you warmed his bed and mended his clothes that makes you family? You were just something pretty for him to come home to. The gold is ours by right." Dutch had moved to the floorboards now, testing each plank with his boot, listening for the hollow sound that would mean a hiding place. Mary Ellen's heart hammered against her ribs as his heavy feet moved closer to where she'd buried Jake's final sin. "Nothing here," Dutch grunted, moving past the loose boards without noticing. His heavy boots had made too much noise for him to hear the subtle difference in sound. But Brennan was watching Mary Ellen's face, reading the relief she couldn't quite hide. His scarred smile widened. "Now that's interesting," he said slowly. "Dutch just walked right over something, didn't he? And you look mighty pleased about it." He stood up from Jake's chair, his hand moving to the gun at his side. "Boys, I think we need to be a little more thorough with our search." The morning light streaming through the broken door caught the metal of Brennan's pistol as he drew it smooth and easy. The cabin suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing in like a coffin. Mary Ellen looked at Tommy one more time, saw the war playing out behind his young eyes, and wondered if Jake's ghost was watching what his choices had brought down on the woman who'd loved him. The gun pressed against her temple felt cold as winter steel, but the secret Mary Ellen was about to reveal would shatter everything these men thought they knew about Jake Cassidy's death. The barrel of Brennan's gun found a soft spot just above Mary Ellen's ear, cold metal that promised an ending she wasn't ready for. Her breath came short and shallow, but her mind stayed sharp as broken glass. 3 months of living with Jake's ghost had taught her that fear was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Last chance, darling," Brennan whispered, his scarred face so close she could smell the tobacco and whiskey on his breath. "Where'd Jake hide our gold?" "Brennan." Tommy's voice cut through the cabin's tension like a prayer in church. "This ain't right. She's just a woman. Jake's woman." Dutch laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Boy's got himself sweet on the widow. Always did have a soft spot for pretty things." "Shut your mouth, Dutch." Tommy's hand dropped to his gun, and something dangerous flickered in his young eyes. "I'm talking to Brennan." "No, you ain't." Brennan kept the gun pressed to Mary Ellen's temple, but turned his head toward Tommy. "You're forgetting your place, boy. And you're forgetting who runs this outfit now, that Jake's feeding worms." The cabin went deadly quiet except for the wind whistling through the broken door. Mary Ellen could feel the violence building like a storm, could sense the moment when words would give way to bullets and blood. She'd seen it before, in the months before Jake died, the way his old gang had started to fracture and turn on itself. "The gold's under the floorboards," she said quietly. "By the fireplace." Brennan's scarred face split into a triumphant grin. "Now that wasn't so hard, was it?" He gestured with his free hand toward Dutch. "Pull the boards up." But Mary Ellen wasn't done talking. "You want to know something else, Brennan? You want to know why Jake never spent his share of the Millerville money?" "Don't much care, long as we get what's ours." He was going to give it back. The words dropped into the silence like stones into still water. All of it. He'd found religion, said he wanted to make things right before he died. Dutch's hands stilled on the floorboards. Tommy went pale as morning frost. But it was Brennan's reaction that mattered most. The way his gun hand trembled just slightly, the way his scarred face went tight with something that might have been fear. "You're lying." "Am I?" Mary Ellen met his eyes without flinching. "Jake spent his last months writing letters, Brennan. Letters to every bank, every family, every person you boys ever wronged. He was going to turn himself in, give back every stolen dollar, and drag all you down with him. That's why you killed him." The gun at her temple wavered. Brennan's face had gone white beneath his scars. "Jake died in a shootout with the law. Everyone knows that. Everyone knows what you wanted them to know." Mary Ellen's voice stayed steady as stone. "But I was there that night, Brennan. I saw you and Dutch drag his body back to town. So you put bullets in him after he was already dead. So you arranged things so it looked like the law got him instead of his own partners." Tommy's gun cleared leather faster than a striking snake. The barrel found Dutch's chest before the big man could react. "That true, Dutch? You boys killed Jake. Now hold on." Dutch raised his hands, his face gone slack with panic. "Answer him." Mary Ellen's voice cut like a blade. "Tell Tommy how his hero, Jake Cassidy, really died. Tell him how you put a rope around his neck because he wanted to go straight." Brennan's gun swung away from Mary Ellen's head toward Tommy, but the young man was ready for it. Two shots cracked out in the confined space, loud as thunder, and then Dutch was falling backward into the scattered flour and broken furniture. Tommy's smoking gun stayed, trained on Brennan, who had dropped his own weapon to clutch at his shoulder where Tommy's second bullet had found its mark. Blood seeped between the scarred man's fingers, dark and wet in the morning light. "You killed him," Tommy said, and his voice broke like a boy's voice breaks. "You killed Jake, and I helped you cover it up. He was going to ruin us all." Brennan gasped through gritted teeth. "Turn us in like common criminals. After everything we'd been through together, all the blood we'd spilled side by side. He was trying to save his soul," Mary Ellen said quietly. "And yours too, if you'd let him." Tommy's gun hand shook like a leaf in wind. "All this time I thought he died fighting. Thought he went out with honor. Honor." Brennan spat blood onto the cabin floor. Jake forgot about honor the day he decided to betray his own brothers. The floorboards lay scattered around Dutch's still form, and there in the exposed earth sat the canvas sack that had started all this trouble. 27 gold pieces that had cost Jake his life and his soul, and now had claimed Dutch Morrison too. Tommy looked at the gold, then at Brennan clutching his wounded shoulder, then at Mary Ellen standing steady as a pine tree in the wreckage of her home. "What do we do now?" he asked, and for the first time since he'd kicked down her door, he sounded like the lost boy he really was underneath all that gun leather and false courage. Mary Ellen looked at the blood on her floor, at the dead man who'd helped murder her husband, at the wounded one who'd given the orders, and at the young one who was just beginning to understand what kind of men he'd chosen to follow. The morning sun slanted through the broken door, catching the dust motes dancing in the air like tiny spirits, and she wondered if Jake was somewhere watching, somewhere learning whether redemption was possible even for the damned. In the end, the gold lay scattered like fallen stars, but what Mary Ellen and Tommy found in the ashes of violence was worth more than all the treasure Jake Cassidy ever stole. The silence that followed gunfire always felt different from other kinds of quiet. It was heavy with the weight of choices that couldn't be undone, thick with the smell of powder smoke and spilled blood. Mary Ellen stood in the wreckage of her cabin and listened to that terrible silence, broken only by Brennan's labored breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling high above the canyon. Tommy's gun hung loose in his hand, the barrel still warm from the shots that had ended Dutch Morrison's life and shattered Brennan McClure's shoulder. The young outlaw stared at what he'd done with eyes that seemed older than his 22 years, older than they'd been just minutes before when the truth about Jake's death had torn through him like a blade. "I need bandages," Mary Ellen said quietly, looking at the blood seeping between Brennan's fingers. "Unless you want him to bleed out on my floor, too. Maybe that's what he deserves." Tommy's voice came out rough as sandpaper. "After what he did to Jake. Maybe." Mary Ellen knelt beside Dutch's still form and closed his eyes with gentle fingers. Even killers deserved that much dignity in death. But Jake spent his last months learning that what folks deserve and what they need aren't always the same thing. She moved to the wooden chest by her bed, the one piece of furniture the men hadn't destroyed in their search. Inside, wrapped in clean cloth, were the bandages she'd learned to keep ready during her years as an outlaw's wife. Too many nights of patching bullet holes and knife wounds had taught her that mercy was sometimes the hardest choice a person could make. Brennan watched her approach with wary eyes, his scarred face pale from blood loss and pain. "Why?" he asked through gritted teeth as she began to bind his shoulder. "Why help me after everything?" "Because Jake asked me to." Her hands worked steady and sure, wrapping the wound with practiced efficiency. In those letters he wrote before he died, said if anything happened to him, I should remember that every man deserves a chance to choose who he wants to be in the end. Tommy lowered his gun finally, the weight of it seeming too much for his shaking hands. What was in those letters? The ones Jake wrote. Mary Ellen finished with Brennan's bandages and sat back on her heels. Names. Addresses. Every person you boys ever wronged. Every family you left hungry. Every bank clerk who lost his job because of money you stole. She looked between the two surviving outlaws, and instructions on how to make it right. The canvas sack lay forgotten in the exposed earth beneath the floorboards, 27 gold pieces catching the morning light like fallen stars. But none of them were looking at it anymore. The treasure that had brought them all to this moment of blood and truth seemed suddenly small compared to the weight of Jake Cassidy's final wishes. He wanted to give it all back, Mary Ellen continued. Every last coin. Said a man could carry guilt for only so long before it crushed him flat. Brennan laughed, a bitter sound that turned into a cough. Fool notion. Money's money. Don't matter where it comes from, don't it? Tommy's young voice carried a new kind of strength. Dutch is dead because of that money. Jake's dead because of it. How many more got to die before we say enough? You sound like him, Brennan said with disgust. Sound like Jake near the end, all full of regret and righteousness. Maybe that ain't such a bad thing. Mary Ellen watched the war playing out behind Tommy's eyes. The boy he'd been fighting against the man he might become. She'd seen the same battle in Jake's face during those final months, when he'd started waking up screaming from dreams filled with the faces of people he'd wronged. The letters are in the root cellar, she said quietly, along with a list of where every stolen dollar should go. Jake spent weeks working on it, making sure every debt was accounted for. Tommy's head came up like a hound scenting something on the wind. You're saying there's a way to make this right? All of it. I'm saying Jake thought there was. Question is whether you boys are brave enough to try. The afternoon sun had climbed high enough to slant through the broken door at a different angle, painting the cabin floor in patterns of light and shadow. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the scent of sage and distant rain. It would storm before evening. Mary Ellen could feel it in the air. Brennan struggled to his feet, his good hand pressed against the wall for support. I ain't spending what's left of my life playing Santa Claus to folks I robbed fair and square. He looked at Tommy with something that might have been pity or contempt. You want to throw your life away on a dead man's foolish dreams. That's your business. But leave me out of it. Where you going to go, Brennan? Tommy asked. Law's already got your description from here to San Francisco. Dutch is dead. Gang's finished. What you got left except running until somebody put a bullet in your back? Brennan's scarred face twisted, more than I'd have tried to play saint. He stumbled toward the broken door, favoring his wounded shoulder. At the threshold, he turned back one last time. That gold belongs to all of us by right. You let her keep it. You're spitting on Jake's grave. Jake's grave is where he put himself, Tommy said quietly, when he chose to be better than what we made him. Brennan's laugh was uglier than his scars. Boy, you're going to learn there ain't no such thing as better. There's just different kinds of damned. He stepped through the doorway into the bright canyon sunlight. When you figure that out, don't come looking for me. His footsteps faded across the hard ground, leaving Tommy and Mary Ellen alone with Dutch's cooling body and 27 pieces of gold that had cost more lives than they were worth. Tommy holstered his gun and knelt beside the exposed hiding place. His fingers brushed the canvas sack but didn't lift it. Jake really thought this would work? Giving it all back, he thought it was worth trying. Mary Ellen began gathering the scattered contents of her home. Flour and fabric, broken dishes, and torn curtains. Small things that could be mended or replaced. Said the trying was what mattered, not whether folks forgave him for it. And if they don't? Forgive us, I mean. Mary Ellen looked at the young man kneeling by her ruined floorboards, saw the weight of his choices settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. Then at least you'll know you try to be the man Jake wanted you to become. The wind outside carried the first promise of rain, clean and sweet after months of dust. Tommy lifted the canvas sack from its hiding place and held it in his hands like it weighed more than gold should weigh. Reckon Jake would laugh if he could see us now, he said. All this fuss over money we're fixing to give away. I think he'd be proud, Mary Ellen said. Especially of you. Tommy's smile was the first real one she'd seen from him since he'd kicked down her door. You think there's enough daylight left to start reading them letters? Mary Ellen looked through her broken doorway at the sun climbing toward its peak, at the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, at the endless sweep of canyon and desert that had sheltered outlaws and saints alike. Tommy Walsh, she said, I think we got all the time in the world. The gold lay scattered between them like seeds waiting to be planted, And for the first time in longer than she could remember, Mary Ellen Cassidy felt something that might have been hope taking root in the ruins of her carefully built solitude.